Welcome to Tuesdays with Tom, the Procurious podcast series featuring exclusive insights from Tom Derry, CEO of the Institute for Supply Management. The topic of today's podcast is supply management in the age of hyper-competitivity. Procurious founder Tanya Siri will discuss with Tom how to turn a supply chain into a key source of competitive advantage for your organization and what not to do in supply chain management. Over to you, Tanya and Tom.
Although everyone loves to talk about the romance of startups and small businesses, today it's becoming increasingly obvious that we're living in the age of the corporate giants. Big brands such as Apple, Amazon, Google, and Walmart are only getting bigger. There's a host of reasons these giants are found in the top 10 places of the Fortune 500 year after year. But one reason that really stands out for me is that they recognize their supply chains are a key source of competitive advantage. Tom, what are the elements that transform a supply chain into something that a company would proudly put front and center in its annual report to shareholders?
Well, I mean, there are two obvious ones that come to mind immediately. One that we've known for a while, which is sort of last mile customization in supply chains. You're serving regional customers and local customers, even if you've got a global supply chain. And local markets demand customization and localization, even if it's just simply printing your user manual in the local language, right? HP did that famously a decade or more ago. But Diageo, the liquor brand, is customizing for delivery in Asia and Southeast Asia from its distribution center in Singapore. So actually being able to access local markets and extract the most value from local markets is critical from supply chain. And the other one that's come to light very recently in light of all the controversy around taxes and tariffs is that supply chains are a form of agility, right? If they're flexible and responsive, they provide strategic agility to the company, and that's becoming increasingly critical. In fact, the most important consideration in determining how a supply chain is structured usually comes down to two economic considerations, taxes and tariffs. So in January, the United States passed a new tax law here in this country, which ostensibly puts U.S. manufacturing, for instance, a little bit more on an even playing field with other locations around the globe. We'll see if that materializes. But the discussion around tariffs is critical, and even the threat of tariffs, whether or not they've been implemented yet, is already affecting the way supply chains are designed and implemented. Here in the United States, the paradox that we imposed steel and aluminum tariffs on European exports to the U.S. has led to retaliation on Harley-Davidson motorcycles, and Harley-Davidson has announced that it's going to have to shift production to the European Union in order to continue to grow its non-U.S. sales, which are critical to the company's future growth. So while the president ostensibly is trying to protect on a national security basis the production of steel and aluminum in the United States, he's actually forcing the production of finished goods, in this case motorcycles, offshore and thereby threatening jobs. So that's one. And that's only one example. ConAgra, the American food producer, maker of all kinds of food products, has announced that it's going to shift production from the United States to Canada in order to avoid tariffs that would be imposed for U.S.-based exports. So, if the old concept is money is fungible, but supply chains are flexible, and some people may not appreciate the degree to which we've built in agility and flexibility in supply chains over the last 20 years. It's clear that companies can respond and have to respond in order to maintain margin and maintain competitive advantage, and they will, right? They're going to flex their supply chains to meet the circumstances that they face. And I think we're all short-sighted if we think that's not going to happen, and if we think we can impose a set of conditions that will kind of cause the current supply chains as they exist today to be set in place. They're going to flex and move.
I was going to joke with you. What does this mean about your collection of Harley-Davidson motorcycles? Does that actually go up?
I wish I were the owner of a hog. That would be really cool. But I think they only become more valuable in the United States.
But it's absolutely true, of course. The last mile customization, that's the challenge to everyone now. And we have some great examples of companies doing that. Obviously, taxes and tariffs. But what are you seeing with technology? For example, we're hearing a lot about the China Belt Road Initiative, which of course links the old Silk Road from China to Europe, and all the infrastructure development that will be associated with that. The Internet of Things and sensors, blockchain is all being used in that massive project. So, is this yet another example of the hyper-connectivity and hyper-competitivity, I guess, that you're seeing in the supply chain?
No question about it. I mean, the Belt and Road Initiative is something that is going to transform, I think, let's say the second half of the 21st century by the time it finally all comes together. And there are two key sort of strategic advantages that the initiative promises to China. One is direct access to European markets through the old Silk Road, via the old Silk Road, and the dependency on the infrastructure that countries that are along that trade route will develop in relation to China's investment in that infrastructure. And as you mentioned, the technology along with it. Think about the amount of effort and frankly, waste that happens in supply chains today as products are shipped and checked and repacked and distributed further, and there's customs checks, and then there's discrepancies between invoice and shipment. There's an awful lot of manpower spent on non-value-added activity in supply chains today. So in addition to having this new trade route established with dependency on the infrastructure to move products and services, you'll have the additional layered on it strategic advantage of virtually a seamless supply chain without the friction that currently exists, without the need to recheck and repack, because you know what, the devices, if we're talking about goods traveling with devices, they'll travel with the data associated with that shipment. You know where it was manufactured, you know the batch number, you know the end customer, you'll have financial data in terms of invoice traveling with it. There's no need other than for it to run by an RFID scanner and record that information automatically into a machine. There's no need to unpack or recheck. So think about the efficiency that will exist. And that's a massive expanse. I mean, what is the distance between China and European markets? It's got to be, 10,000, 12,000 miles over land. Think about the efficiencies that will be achieved there. It's pretty startling what they're working on. I would say from a U.S. point of view today, or for other folks concerned about the ascendancy of China as a global trade powerhouse, a lot of that technology today is still developed in the United States, but that doesn't mean it will be in 10 years' time. And China will be building in its own technological capability over the next decade.
I'll just jump in there. I mean, you started to touch on the mistakes that people are making, and I guess we always love to focus on this at Procurious. Let's talk about what not to do. So what are the areas where you see supply management professionals making avoidable errors?
One is not understanding your supply chain beyond the first tier. There's a concept in the academic literature around nexus suppliers, and they share this attribute where companies who compete in the same industry, automotive or pharmaceutical. I almost said pharmaceutical. I just created my own new category. And other industries, if you look 2, 3, 4 tiers down into the supply chain, there are often common suppliers that everyone relies on. And it's not common knowledge typically that component or that ingredient or that technology is central to everyone's competitiveness. So not knowing where those nexus suppliers lie and the risks associated with that supplier, sometimes not a very large company coming under financial pressure, it has implications not just for your company but for the entire industry. So that's a kind of a profound example of the risks that exist with both sole source and single source suppliers, which is another sometimes unavoidable but not always unavoidable situation. And we've seen supply chains time and time again disrupted because there was a lack of understanding. I'm aware of one example in which a pharmaceutical company was looking at levels of spend for risk management purposes and decided to avoid or exclude anything under $1 million US because it was just not material. It was too small. Well, it turns out they spent $200,000 a year for the coating on a consumer medication, and there was a fire in that factory. So that supported $2 billion in annual sales for that medication. So 1/1000th of 1% of sales relied on a single source provider. And by the way, this is an FDA-regulated product in the United States, so you can't just go out and qualify a new coating supplier overnight. That can be a 9-month process. So if you don't understand where your pressure points are in the supply chain, your business is really in trouble. And believe me, that gets the attention of the CEO or the board of directors when you walk in and say, we've got a problem and my $2 billion product line sales might be endangered for the next 9 months. I mean, that's a massive problem.
It certainly is. So, Tom, thank you for your time today. It was great to cover off on supply management in the age of hyper-competitivity. Well, it's quite a complicated term to pronounce, that one, isn't it? And thank you for wrapping up with some of the what not to do. I'll speak to you shortly.
Thank you for listening to our Tuesdays with Tom podcast, powered by Procurious and ISM. Stay tuned for more podcasts in this series, which will be made available for streaming in the learning area on Procurious.com.